Good afternoon. On behalf of the Refugee Support Team of the Nauset Interfaith Association, I welcome you to this timely educational event, whether you're here in person or joining us via live streaming. And a special welcome to our speaker, Emily Lung, to Mark Baker, our media guru, and to Darren Morgan, the pastor of the Federated Church of Orleans. Every day, we hear or we read about something related to immigration. It could be about people entering the United States at our southern border, or about the need for legislation in Congress. It could be about the plight of refugees from Ukraine or other countries. Or it could be about migrants who are mistreated within our own borders in the United States. Or it could be about what's happening on the joint base of Cape Cod, which I'm sure we'll hear more about today. The genesis for today's event was the recognition within our own refugee support team that there was much we did not know or understand about the process of immigration, the categories of migrants, what migrants need, or about legislation that we should be advocating for. So today, we're really fortunate to have Emily Lung, an immigration attorney, with us to help us be more informed and even more motivated to assist the vulnerable who cross our borders, only seeking to live, work, and thrive with us in our country. All faiths share the golden rule, the principle of treating others as one wants to be treated. So today, may all of us learn something that will help us to treat immigrants the way we would want to be treated in similar circumstances. After the presentation, we'll open the program up for your questions. For those who are here, please raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. And please speak into the microphone so that people who are live streaming will be able to hear your questions. For home viewers, you will see on the screen a phone number that you can text questions to, and you'll also see a Gmail address that you can write your questions to. If there are similar questions, we might combine them. So I hope you enjoy the program today, and now I'd like to invite my friend and colleague, Tom Ryan, up, who will introduce our speaker.
Emily Lung earned her MA in International Relations at Boston University and her JD also at the BU School of Law. Upon earning those degrees, she worked in a number of nonprofit groups and what her bio calls boutique law firms in Boston, learning more on the ground about asylum law, family-based petitions, removal, defense, and she has been working for a number of years now, and it was my pleasure to meet her several years ago, working for Justice Center of Southeast Massachusetts, which is a subsidiary of South Coastal Legal Services of Southeast Massachusetts. And she's the supervising immigration attorney there at Justice Center, where she oversees a robust team of other advocates, and they are all involved in individual representation, in advocacy, and in community education. So as part of their mission of community education, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our friend, our colleague, Emily Lung.
Rod showed me, but hopefully that's working. Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. As Tom said, my name is Emily Lung. I'm the supervising immigration attorney at the Justice Center of Southeast Massachusetts, which is a subsidiary of South Coastal County's Legal Services, which is a very complex name that we have, but actually for a very specific reason, which is pertinent to this conversation, which is that a portion of federal funding is allocated to the provision of civil legal services to individuals who are low income. But there was a change in the provision of those funds to specifically exclude provision of services to immigrants. And so therefore, we had to create other types of structures like subsidiary structures that don't receive those federal funds in order to ensure that we are also providing services to our immigrant community members. So that giant mouthful actually has a very specific purpose that relates to our work, but it's a lot to keep track of, I understand. So I'm very happy for this invitation, and as Tom said, part of our mission, in addition to representing individuals directly in their cases, is also to engage with service providers, community members, directly with client populations, to talk about what's happening in immigration law, to work with allies who can provide additional support, because we cannot serve everybody in our service area, which includes all of Plymouth County, all of Bristol County, all of Barnstable County, all of the Cape and the Islands, and our team is only about 10 or 12 people, so we couldn't possibly represent everyone in the region. And also, many folks that we work with, because we specifically work with low-income communities, also need a lot of other social services and just social support that is outside the scope of what we can provide. We do our very best to make connections with folks, with other service providers, and with community members that are trying to be helpful with teams like yours, but certainly it does take a village, so to speak, to provide support to newly arrived individuals. So I was asked today to kind of give a Immigration 101. I know that a lot of folks involved in work on the Cape have worked specifically with refugee populations. I will do my very best to give some overview and general information that I think will provide a helpful foundation, but I have to provide the disappointing news that I will not be able to provide a full top to bottom intro to all of immigration law, because unless we want to have many days of sleepovers in the church here, we won't be able to accomplish that. But I'll do my very best to kind of provide a foundation, and I know there'll be time for Q&A, but also within the presentation, if there is a question that would be helpful for clarification, there's likely other folks that would also like that clarification. So feel free to kind of, I don't know if that's allowed, but I would say feel free to answer the question, ask some questions if it's for clarification purposes. My experience is that when one person has a question, actually 5 people have the question and only one person felt comfortable to ask it. So best to kind of clear that up. So I'm going to launch in, but like I said, if there are things that would be helpful to clarify or things that are not clear, just let me know so we can kind of go over them. So from the very basic concept of what is immigration law and what do we mean by immigration law? And so immigration is an interesting area of law because it is completely controlled on a federal basis in terms of what the laws are. But as many folks who've worked with this group and other groups know, there's still a role for states and localities in terms of how they develop policies that are either welcoming or, I would say, not welcoming of immigrant populations within their communities. But in terms of the law of immigration that relates to the entry and exits of individuals into the US and the ability for someone to get immigration status, that is controlled by the federal government, sort of as like a baseline. So in terms of the PowerPoint, this is a very old, Mark, if you can move to this slide, thank you. This is actually from a 2008 graphic. Most of the information is still accurate, but I very often refer to this graphic for the reason that people talk about immigration a lot and they talk about immigrants a lot, but there's not a good generalized understanding of what it means to kind of go through an immigration process and get immigration status. And when someone has the great fortune, which I know we are not maybe at a high point as a country in terms of our democracy, but I think that it's still fair to say if you had the great fortune of being born in this country, then you perhaps don't have awareness of the systems that must be navigated for someone to also achieve sort of stable immigration status in the United States. And also, if you weren't born in this country, but it's been a very long time since your family has sort of established themselves in here, the immigration laws actually change very frequently. They've become much harsher over time. They've become much more narrow. And so, you know, when people talk about like their families having possibly come through Ellis Island or Angel Island on the West Coast, that is not representative of what the process looks like now, even though people did go through a process at that time. So this chart shows just sort of like very basically individuals who are kind of, you know, we have the man trying to say like, well, how am I going to come to the United States? And they're representing that there are a bunch of pathways in which people actually don't have any legal options because the legal options are quite narrow. And then also on the far right side of the graphic, we have this man with his very long beard, which is the representation of the fact that immigration processes can sometimes take upwards of 20 years, which I think is not something that people realize. So for example, if I'm a US citizen, which I am fortunate to be one, and I want to petition for my sibling who is an overseas national, I am allowed to petition for my sibling. There is a category for that under sort of family-based immigration. But let's say I was from the Philippines, the backlog for cases in that country would mean that my sibling would wait upwards of 20 years right now in order to be able to immigrate to the United States lawfully. So this chart isn't meant to be sort of comprehended as a whole, but I think it's a good representation of the fact that there are sometimes folks who unfortunately don't have a legal pathway at all, and then there are other folks who are going to be waiting a very, very, very long time. You're talking years, maybe a decade, maybe more, to go through their legal process. So I think it's just kind of like a good high-level reminder of like what the immigration process can look like. There are faster processes. I will say that in immigration speak, when we say something is immediate or fast, that is still generally minimally a year. So time has a very different concept within our workspace. And that has a lot to do with the fact that we work with the federal government and various federal agencies, and they are not as speedy as we might like them to be, and there is a lot of bureaucracy, and every form has 5 extra pages in my opinion, but that's just one woman's opinion about that. If we can move to the next slide, Mark. So I think what is also important sort of high-level context in terms of working and interacting with folks within immigrant communities is the fact that if you have not had a lot of experience, which I imagine most people here actually have, with immigrant communities, you may not realize how much your immigration status touches so many different parts of your lives. For example, if you're a citizen, then you would have been issued a social security card when you were a child. But if you are an immigrant, you have to get work authorization or other immigration legal status in order to get a social security number, as one example. Immigrants are also not eligible for the majority of state and federal benefits. There are some exceptions within those, but you know, your immigration status does relate to your ability to be able to get benefits. The consequences for you within the criminal justice system can be extremely severe. The definition, the common definition that we might use in regular conversation for a felony, immigration has a completely different definition, and that definition applies to any immigrants who are not citizens, which could jeopardize their immigration status. There's a lot to unpack in the world of the intersection of immigrant communities in the criminal justice system, also because a lot of those communities are Black and brown communities who also suffer from over-policing and tend to get higher charges, get less options in terms of diversion programs and things like that. But we only have limited time today to talk about things. And all of these other things, you know, I think immigrants and driver's license is probably something hopefully people are aware of, which is we can choose as a state to extend driver's licenses to all the individuals who live in the Commonwealth. I thought we had chosen that, but we have to choose again in the upcoming election, which I hope many of you will. But these are just some examples of the way that your immigration status is going to touch so many parts of your life, even though it may not seem obvious that there's any connection between those things. And frankly, from my personal opinion, it's not clear to me that there should be a connection between those things. Another example in education is there are many, many immigrants who earn Adams scholarships because they've gone to school in Massachusetts and done well in school, and the Adams scholarship cannot be utilized by individuals who don't have appropriate immigration status, even though they qualified and earned the scholarship to attend state schools. We could change that as a state. We can make our own decisions because that is a state-based scholarship program to attend state-based institutions, but these are, again, examples. So this area is more of a mix of state, local, and federal law. The pathways to immigration status are all federally set, but where the immigration status touches everything else, it's more of a mix of things. Any questions? Yes? The question was, I can repeat. The question was whether individuals who have DACA are eligible for the Adams Scholarship, and I believe they are, that the Department of Education, that there was an interpretation by the Massachusetts Department of Education to interpret that status as affording them the opportunity to use their Adams Scholarship. I'm pretty sure. I can circle back. I'll confirm and email Rod. But I'm pretty sure on that one. Any other general questions yet? Okay, all right. We can go to the next slide. So this slide, which is entitled, What Are Immigration Statuses? The term immigration status is really a term of art. It doesn't, we use that term all the time because that's how we talk about things in immigration. But I think what is important to know is what we mean by immigration status is what is your status? For example, are you a citizen? Are you a green card holder? Do you have DACA? Do you have temporary protected status? Those would all be considered immigration statuses. And I arranged on this slide statuses in what I would call a spectrum. And so we'll call them a spectrum of increasing rights. So individuals who have no status or who are undocumented have the least amount of rights. That doesn't mean constitutionally there are constitutional protections that extend to all individuals who are in the United States. But if you look at our chart, they have limited access or they're barred from sort of political, social, economic rights. They don't have a right to work. They can be removed, meaning deported from the United States. And then as you kind of move up the spectrum, then in different types of categories, you have different rights that might attach to that. So in the these are just samples. There are many other immigration statuses. But this is just an example to demonstrate that what your status is also attaches to what your rights are within our system. So a visitor, if you've ever traveled to a country where you required a visitor visa, if you're a US citizen or whatever citizenship you have, we have a similar system in the US. Many individuals who come to the United States have to apply for visas at US-based consulates and embassies, and if they're granted that visa, can come on a limited basis. But for example, a visitor who comes to the United States can only come to the US for a limited period of time. That's granted by immigration. They don't have the right to work. They don't have the right to really do anything except to visit, to just be here. And they could be removed from the United States if they committed any crimes or if they overstayed their visa. That's an example of something where you have lawful permission to enter, you're lawfully allowed to remain for some period of time, but you don't necessarily have a lot of other rights that are attached to that. In the middle, we have these temporary statuses, and part of the reason why I categorize something like DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, and temporary protected status as temporary statuses is because they are temporary, even though they could be extended over a long period of time. But most importantly, they do not lead to a permanent pathway. And so in my mind as an immigration attorney, my goal for every client, if possible, is to get them on a permanent path where citizenship is ultimately something that they can achieve if that's what they want. Because if you are not if you're not a citizen, then there's always going to be some things that you will not be able to do, and there also will continue to be some risk to your status generally only if you violate the terms of being a green card holder, but temporary status is this middle ground where you have the right to be here, you have the right to work, you possibly may even be able to travel in and out of the country, although you generally would need special permission, but you don't have any permanent status, and you don't have the right to what we call family reunification, which means you can't petition for any of your family members. And again, it doesn't put you on a pathway to permanent status, which is my goal. So the next category over is what we call lawful permanent residents or legal permanent residents, or most commonly are known as green card holders. And green card holder is the category that we want to get people into because it's the only one that allows you to then apply for citizenship. And some people, for their own reasons, may not want to become citizens, but being a green card holder is sort of second best to being a citizen in terms of the scope of your rights. And so importantly, you have more political, social, economic rights. You have the right to work. You have the right to some family reunification, meaning you can petition for some of your immediate family members. And you, importantly, have a pathway to citizenship. Most individuals who have green cards will be eligible to apply for citizenship either within 5 years, 4 years, or 3 years of being green card holders, depending on which category that they got their lawful permanent residence from. So green card holders is a great spot for people to be in, and it provides them with a lot of protection and rights. Yeah?
Where are students or H-1Bs?
Yeah.
J.
Sure.
Where are they?
Okay. So the question was, where are students, H-1Bs, Js? So I would say that students and J-1s are in between temporary status and green card holders. They have a right to be here, they have a certain amount of time they can be here, they can renew, but similarly, a student, for example, has a limited amount of time they're allowed to work. They also have to comply with their student visas, meaning they have to be full-time enrolled in an institution that's recognized for immigration purposes. They can't travel just freely in and out of the country because you have to have an appropriate visa in order to enter and exit. H-1Bs, I would say, is also in the middle, but H-1B, individuals who have H-1Bs, first of all, do you folks know what all of these are? Okay. Student visas are what they sound like. They're for individuals who are doing a course of study in the US. You have to be a full-time enrolled student in a institution that's recognized by immigration, and you have to otherwise comply with all the terms of your student visa, which includes having a very limited ability to work and also having some restrictions on traveling in and out of the country. A J-1 program is a special seasonal worker visa. On the Cape, many different businesses use Js to staff during the summers. Same with the ski resorts, like in all of New England. And so Js are seasonal work programs, oftentimes young persons who are coming for maybe 2 years or seasonally to do work in industries to learn. It's sort of a joint, it's almost like an exchange program in some ways. It's meant to say, come to the US, have some experiences here, also work, but it's a combination of sort of cultural exchange and work visa. And then an H-1B is an employment-based visa. We don't do any of those because we serve only a low-income population. Not that H-1Bs are generally for specialty occupations. The majority of H-1B holders have advanced degrees. H-1Bs have the potential for their employers to sponsor them for a permanent process. But H-1Bs are very competitive. The cap for H-1Bs in an annual year is always oversubscribed. And so that this is an issue really in all the immigration categories, that many of them have annual caps on how many individuals can receive visas in various categories. So I would put H-1Bs, Js, and students between temporary status and LPR, but H-1Bs, at least some of them, if their employer is willing, may be able to kind of be on a pathway to permanent. And someone in one of these categories could also pursue another immigration status. Like we work with individuals who might have temporary protected status, but might also be applying for asylum. Or maybe we're working with an individual who was a victim of crime, but they also have the potential for a family-based immigration case. So there are many types of immigration cases that can be run concurrently. They can be happening at the same time, and someone could be on one pathway that is permanent and one that is temporary for now. Other questions?
If you're an American and you're married a foreigner, years ago you used to be automatically allowed to come in.
Yeah.
Have they changed that?
Yeah. So just repeating the question for everyone to hear and those out there on the internet. The question was, if you're a U.S. citizen and you marry someone who's a foreign national, you used to be able to have them immigrate to the United States. Is that still possible? And the answer is, it's complicated. Sometimes you're able to petition for your family members, but sometimes you're not able to. It depends on the foreign national's immigration history, their status. There are a lot of rules around that. There's also rules about economic support. So as a US citizen petitioning for a family member, you have to prove that you would be supporting your family member at 125% of the poverty guidelines at a minimum for your household. The idea being, which I don't agree with, but the idea being that we don't want individuals to come who are going to then be receiving benefits and being supported by us as a country. So sometimes, yes, you can petition for your spouse or children, and sometimes you cannot. And that is a very unfortunate reality, that there are many families that are mixed status where perhaps one parent and the children are all US citizens and the other parent is not able to access legal immigration status. So the last category on our spectrum is a citizen. I think it's likely that many folks here are citizens. And with that, the benefits that you receive, even though some days it doesn't feel that way, is the ability to have access, in theory, to your full political, social, and economic rights. It's not a guarantee, we know that, but theoretically, you have access to those things. And in immigration, we mean that you can hold office, you can run for office, you can vote, you can hold basically any job. It doesn't mean that you will get any job, it just means legally you could hold any job. And also within the immigration system, you have the most ability to family reunification, which means citizens can petition for more categories of family members than, for example, a green card holder, and some categories don't have any right to any family reunification. And you can also enter and exit the United States freely. That doesn't mean that you can enter other countries freely. That depends on their immigration laws, but you have that right. You can also remain outside the US for as long as you want, and that doesn't jeopardize your citizenship. Whereas typically for a green card holder, if you stay outside the United States for more than 6 months at a time, they may presume that you have abandoned your lawful residence in the US, and then you have to go through a very complicated process to reinstate it. So we just advise all our clients, please don't do that. There are some special exceptions, just in case, I don't know why it would come up, but if someone is doing a foreign course of study, if someone has a job placement and they're a green card holder outside, you can ask for advance permission to be outside the US for an extended period. And we also know in COVID, some people did get stuck outside, and immigration was a little more flexible in those circumstances. But as a general rule, as a green card holder, you are supposed to not be outside of the United States for more than 6 months at a time. That is just a high-level overview of sort of how your rights shift as you're kind of going across the spectrum of different types of immigration statuses. Rod informed me that a lot of folks here work with asylees and refugees, so I was going to spend a little bit more time talking about sort of the differences for those folks, and I feel like the word parolee has popped up a lot in recent times, so I'll do my best to explain that word, which unfortunately is extremely nebulous and used for many situations, which is part of why it's difficult to understand. But I'm also happy to talk about other topics as well if that doesn't feel on point for our group. Yes?
Question, if you're a citizen and you're born in another country, do our laws allow you to be a dual citizen? Can you be a citizen of another country as well as the U.S. or not?
The question was, if you're a citizen of the US and born in another country, are you allowed to be a dual citizen? And the answer is, it depends on the country.
Oh, really?
Yes. You can be a dual citizen of some countries, but you can't necessarily be a dual citizen of every country, and it relates as much to their immigration laws as ours. So in some countries, they don't allow dual citizenship, and in some narrow instances in the US, because of diplomatic reasons, they don't recognize citizenship from certain countries. But generally, you could. You have to check.
My husband's born in Norway, so.
That's probably going to be okay. Yeah. I think Norway, as long as Norway allows it, then most likely. But it really is frequently more an issue for the non-US country than it is for the US. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between asylees and refugees, and maybe just a little bit about the differences in process for them, if that sounds of interest. And then I'll try to explain this term parolees, which immigration unfortunately uses to capture a very wide group of folks. So the major difference between an asylee and a refugee has to do with how they got their asylee-refugee status. So here in the US, if you encounter someone who is a refugee, they have already been granted refugee status by an agency, usually the UNHCR, and then they have been resettled in the United States through formal refugee resettlement programs. And in Massachusetts, there are several refugee resettlement programs. Maybe we're down to 2. I think Catholic Charities and Accentria, I think is the name now, are our formal refugee resettlement agencies in Massachusetts. So refugees have left their home country. Very frequently, they are processed in refugee camps outside of their own country, usually a neighboring country, or maybe a few countries away, or perhaps from Africa to Europe. You know, there's a lot of movement, but those individuals, they have their interviews and all of their processing happens outside the United States. And then through refugee resettlement, the US sets a cap on the number of refugees that we set caps on everything related to immigration. So we set caps on how many refugees we're willing to accept as a country, and they come formally through the refugee resettlement program and get connected with services and benefits through refugee resettlement programs. And so they go through a very similar process that asylees do, but all of it happens before you encounter them here in the US. So when they come to us in the US, they already have status, they're already getting connected with resettlement programs, and they already have access to benefits and immigration status.
Which?
Refugees.
Refugees.
Correct, refugees.
I never saw the word asylee before.
Really? So refugees and asylees are getting status under the same general set of international laws, which is the Refugee Convention, and there's the Declaration of Human Rights and sort of these general big international laws, a lot of it coming out of World War II. And under the definition, these are individuals who are fleeing persecution based on what we call a protected ground. And the idea is that they are either being persecuted by their government, or their government is unable or unwilling to protect them for a variety of reasons, even if their government isn't the one persecuting them. So that is the law that kind of covers both refugees and asylees, but their process is very different. So as I said, refugees are they're always processed outside the United States, and so when we meet them here in the US, they already have some connection to services and already have their immigration status and have access to other supportive services and also some short-term benefits to help them kind of adjust and get on their way. Yes?
Did you say how many refugee resettlement places there are or programs there are in the U.S.?
I did not. I do not know the number of refugee resettlement programs in the US. In Massachusetts, I know of 2. I think those are the 2 that we have. Yes.
The annual cap 110,000?
The question was whether the refugee cap was 110,000. I do not remember what they raised the cap to. I know we're not meeting our current cap and that the cap was dramatically lowered during the Trump administration. at the lowest cap that we'd ever seen since the beginning of the refugee resettlement program. I know that Biden committed to raising the cap. One of the links in the presentation, which is on the next slide, actually has a 2021 profile of asylees and refugees in the US, including what the cap numbers are, which countries they resettled from, and all of that information. But I do not, unfortunately, have that top of mind. I think that is approximately the right number. I know it initially went to 65,000, I think, and then I think it got further raised. So turning to asylees, it's the same protection. It's protection for individuals who are fleeing persecution based on either persecution by their government or persecution that their government is unwilling or unable to protect them from. It does have to be on account of one of these protected classes, which are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. And what that means is that people may be fleeing some type of persecution, but if it doesn't have a connection to one of these categories, then it's not going to be, they're not going to receive protection. Yeah?
You said there's not protection by their government. They can have a complaint against an individual or something.
Yes.
Right? So explain that to me. I don't understand where you say they're not protected by their government.
Sure.
Do you mind?
No, of course. So the question was, when I'm saying that they're not protected by their government, could they have a complaint against an individual, or how does it work when it's not the government who is persecuting them? So an example is, here's two examples of types of cases that we have done very frequently. There are many countries that on paper may have laws that protect against domestic violence, but in reality do not actually provide protection to women who are being abused by family members. And so in a case like that, we would argue and show through what we call country condition research, which means articles, experts, nonprofit, and human rights groups who've done reporting and research on that country that demonstrate that this individual, despite the fact that maybe there is a law on the books that says that there is protection from domestic violence, is not getting any protection from their government.
So then the research would be about country practice more.
Yes.
More than an individual needing to prove that they had gone to their government or they had not received support. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the question is whether the country condition research would be more about general country conditions, or would it be about proving that that individual specifically did not get protection or tried to seek protection. And I would say it's actually the combination of those things. So we frequently have had, unfortunately, the experience of clients who did try to go to the police and report abuse that they had suffered, and the police have said a variety of terrible things to them, up to and including, it's your husband's prerogative to do whatever he wants with you. So in some cases it's that, in some cases that's the argument we would make in combination with the general country practice. In some cases we might argue that there is sufficient evidence within the body of what happens in the country and the research that other people have done that there's no reason why this person should have had to try to report their abuser to the police, because it would have been more dangerous for them. And if folks have had any experience with individuals who have been survivors of domestic violence or other family abuse, frequently that can escalate the abuse that happens by trying to actually report or hold accountable your abuser. So that's an example of a category where, yes, it's not the government that's doing the abuse directly, but the government, we're showing that the government is unwilling to protect you. Yeah. So for asylum seekers are individuals who are coming to the United States and either at the border or within the United States are asking to apply for asylum. And so when they're in that process, they're called asylum seekers. And when they win their cases, they're called asylees. And the laws that surround their protection are the same protection that refugees are granted, but the difference is that their process happens in the United States. So they're either presenting themselves at the border, or they're apprehended by immigration and then explaining that they have a fear of return, or they came into the US on a visa or otherwise came to the United States and then are applying affirmatively for asylum. So that process is very different because The refugee process, for example, we actually don't have any involvement in. As legal services in the US, maybe we would help someone who is a refugee after they've been here for a year to apply for their green card. But we would not have any involvement in their refugee process because that would happen before they came to the United States. In contrast, the asylum process we are extremely involved in because those individuals are making those claims here in the United States. Unfortunately, the process for asylum in the US is very long and quite difficult. And getting competent legal representation is really critical to those cases, but also very hard. We generally put in well over 100 hours per single asylum case. And so that's a lot of resources, which is we're very happy to do, but it also limits the other work we can do. And that's true also of private attorneys. Unfortunately, because we have to do all of these different parts related to the country conditions and the client's story and testimony, it is just is work intensive, not to mention that the clients that we're working with have frequently suffered trauma, so we're also trying to engage in that case preparation with the least amount of re-traumatization that we can, which means we have to take more time, we have to try to connect them with social services. All that being said, the asylum process in the US it starts with an asylum application, which is an explanation. It's a lot of biographic information. Everything in immigration is a lot of biographic information. But then after that, there's sort of a questions regarding what harm you fear or what harm you faced or what harm your family had faced, and that sort of forms the basis of your case. But ultimately in those cases, what we do in our office and many attorneys do is prepare an entire affidavit statement from the client of their narrative. If we're in a court case, we'll also provide a legal brief in support of the case. We do the country conditions research to support all of the legal claims that we're making and to corroborate the client's story. We might get psychological evaluation for the client to demonstrate the harm, maybe a medical physical evaluation to demonstrate the harm if that's an element of their case. Sometimes we also get experts because the client's case, the support that is out there already, we feel like it needs to be supplemented by someone who has specific expertise like in that type of claim for that country. So the asylum process, there's two postures that an asylum case can be in. We call them the affirmative posture and the defensive posture. An affirmative asylum case is a case that's being filed with the asylum office. That's part of US Citizenship and Immigration Services. And that is a benefits giving agency, which means that it's also where you make your applications for green cards. It's also where you make your applications for work permits. It's an agency that is should be non-adversarial. So you're presenting your claim to the asylum office. You'll have an interview with the asylum office, and that officer will adjudicate your claim. That's in the affirmative posture. One issue with the asylum office is that they have an extreme backlog currently for a lot of reasons that already existed before COVID. The oldest case in our office currently was filed in 2013. 2013. Yes. So that client has been waiting, we're getting close to 10 years to present their case to the asylum office, which is difficult because they kind of remain in limbo. They have work permit, they're here, they're waiting, but that is a difficult posture to be in. The other posture of asylum cases is defensive cases, which means someone is in immigration court. There are a lot of ways, bless you, there are a lot of ways that someone may end up in immigration court. Most frequently, they may have been apprehended at the border, in which case they're almost always placed into what are called removal proceedings or deportation proceedings. And if you're before the court, it is a similar process in terms of the evidence that you prepare and present, but one major difference is it is now an adversarial process. Because the government is represented, you hopefully are represented, and a judge decides the case. It's not an officer. The asylum interview happens in an office with an officer sitting across from you asking the person questions, but in the court process, the person is testifying in front of the judge and also will likely be subject to cross-examination by the government on their claims as well. So that's procedurally how they're different. And the court process is also very slow. Everything in immigration, the top theme is everything in immigration is slow. Fast for us, as I said, is maybe 1 year. That's what we call immediate, because that's as immediate as things get in this realm. But those are the general processes. If someone was to win asylum, then they have indefinite status in the US. They're able to apply for their green card 1 year after they receive their asylum status, and that puts them on a pathway to getting citizenship if they so wish to have citizenship. That's sort of the general difference between the processes, and then the two sub-processes of asylum. Yeah?
Kind of a naive question. If somebody has a defensive
Yeah.
policy, are they assigned any legal,
Yeah.
what's the word I want?
Representation? Yeah.
Representation?
So the question was, if someone is in the defensive posture, meaning before the immigration court, would they be assigned any legal representation? And what I would say to that is, I really wish that they were, but they are not. They are entitled to find legal representation on their own. And if they can find legal representation pro bono, then that's great, or they need to find someone that they can pay. And unfortunately, even if you're able to pay, doesn't mean that you'll even be able to get an immigration lawyer still, because there's just not sufficient resources to represent everybody. So there is a percentage of individuals that go unrepresented in front of the immigration court every day.
And how about interpretation or translation?
So the question was, what about interpretation? The court does provide interpretation. So that is helpful, but the only thing that they interpret is the proceedings. So if you are representing someone and you don't speak their language, the interpretation services don't extend to your communication with your clients. They're just interpreting the court process. So our organization, for example, we have a contract actually with 2 language interpretation services, and most of our staff is at least bilingual in a language that some of our clients speak, but certainly we have to get interpretation in order to be able to represent our clients. Yes. The lack of legal representation in immigration court is really a big difficulty. A lot of folks have been trying to fight for that, or at least try to fight for some categories of folks, even though we'd rather have universal representation for everyone. Some areas, notably New York City, did fund their own version of representation for folks. Part of that is because in New York City, they have their immigration legal services is connected with their public defense. And so because they operate all of that representation together, the city put up money to provide representation to a lot of individuals, which is pretty amazing. The city of Boston also developed some funds. It's certainly not universal representation, but the city of Boston also has developed some programs and grants to try to increase representation. But it's really, that's a very unfortunate thing, because the rights that are being implicated by people's court proceedings are very serious, and immigration law is unfortunately very complicated and is frankly changing all the time, and so the lack of representation is really a big challenge. Yeah. Are there any other questions about asylees and refugees before I try to explain what a parolee is? Yeah.
At some point, are you going to talk about an appeal?
Sure.
Or would this be the time to ask about it?
Okay, now would be a good time.
I'm curious about how that might unfold.
Sure. Yeah. So the question was, am I going to talk about an appeal? And the answer is yes, I will do that now. So in the affirmative posture of asylum, and this is actually true of other types of immigration applications, not just of asylum, if that case is denied, then oftentimes that will result in someone being put in removal proceedings, put in immigration court proceedings, at which point they may have an opportunity to apply again before the immigration court. So in asylum specifically, before the asylum office, if your case is denied, then you would typically be sent to immigration court, where you can apply again in front of the judge. And then the judge makes the decision, and if that case is denied, then you have the right to appeal to what is called the Board of Immigration Appeals. And if that case is denied, you don't have the right to appeal, but you can appeal to the First Circuit Court in Mass. The First Circuit is in Massachusetts, but the First Circuit covers our region and covers our immigration court, which is in Boston. Yes?
Our solution for this being to assign more courts in borders where they would handle more people, facilitate things to go more quickly.
So I think the question is, would it be helpful for there to be more immigration courts so things moved more quickly? I think my answer to that would be, depends on how good the judges are going to be. So they're actually already doing that. Our court in Boston has a very high caseload compared to some other courts in the country. And so we have several judges that are in the Richmond, Virginia Adjudication Center that hear cases that are based in Boston. This has actually created a jurisdictional problem for us as lawyers because it has now become unclear which circuit court cases apply to our court, because our cases are Boston cases. Boston is the holder of the case, but they're being heard in Virginia, which is a different circuit than our court. So there are pros and cons. I mean, we're arguing both circuits now in our upcoming cases. I don't know. I think in terms of would more courts or judges improve the process, I think it really depends on what process we are offering people and whether they're able to have representation to actually help them fully flesh out and support their claims. One thing that the Biden administration is promoting is speeding up a lot of processes. And one concern that I have and many other advocates have is, yes, people don't like to be delayed for very long, but the flip side is it can take a very long time to find an attorney, develop a claim, get your evidence together. So it's finding that balance of someone not waiting almost 10 years for their case to be heard, but someone else not being rushed through in 6 or 8 months when they don't have sufficient time to build their case and work with an advocate.
If you're coming for asylum, you left because you can't even go here to come home again, you have to just get out of the country. How do you have time to build a case? I mean, you're on the road, you're trying to get away from the children or family, it seems so
Yes.
absolutely unreasonable to expect an asylum seeker to have it, even think about how they will start, whether they have, how can I prove them and so on.
Yeah.
And how much it does.
I will say the comment was that it seems very unreasonable that asylum seekers who are fleeing dangerous situations for their safety and security should have any focus or attention put on how they're supposed to get evidence or build their case when they're coming here explicitly fleeing persecution. And with that, I agree 100%. And sometimes the benefit of time is that it gives more time to work with them. You know, we've worked with clients of ours with contacts or family members back in their home country to try to compile over time evidence that can be submitted and sent. But all of these are challenges that are faced. And in my opinion, our asylum system, unfortunately, requires to a certain level some re-traumatization of asylum seekers, because they have to provide detailed testimony about their circumstances in order to be successful in their cases. And it's a very difficult balance as an advocate, in my opinion, to be wanting to care for your client, but also want them to win their case, which is going to give them more long-term stability. And you're meeting them often at a time where they are at their most vulnerable. And these are the day-to-day challenges that we face in the asylum system.
Where do they stay for 10 years?
The question was, where do people stay for 10 years? That particular client, fortunately, has work authorization. So he and his family have been supporting themselves and have been lawfully awaiting their asylum case to be heard.
Staying with somebody?
No, they have their own place. You know, they've been here for 9 years, so have been working and are conducting their lives as best they can without with continuing to somewhat be in limbo with their cases. So, yeah?
So they would have to be renters, they couldn't buy something?
So the question was, would they have to be renters? Would they be able to buy something? And I would say that they could buy if they had the resources to do it. It really depends on the lending institution, because individuals who have work authorizations also have social security numbers, and so they are able to open bank accounts and build credit. So it really depends on the lending institution, but they're eligible if the lending institution finds them eligible.
The lending institution is lending money that comes from the federal government, and it usually has strings attached to it or conditions.
Yes, I don't know. So the question was, the lending institutions are lending federally backed loans. I do think, you know what, I'm not going to say the answer because I don't know it. However, I do think that it really just depends on the individual. Sometimes when people are in a immigration process but are not yet in a sort of permanent legal status, they might still be eligible for certain things because they're lawfully here awaiting their case to be adjudicated. And as I said, people with work permission are also eligible for social security numbers, and that often opens the doors to kind of other opportunities. Yeah?
Are there factors other than the particular case, factors that might be more favorable to asylees, like if they're a family,
Sure.
or if they have children here?
Sure.
anything like that?
The question was, are there factors that make a asylum case more favorable? For example, if they have family here, or are there other
Or if
things?
they are a family.
Or if they are a family. And I would say that it really just depends on the claim. It's pretty individualized. I will say that the US's opinion about the foreign country frequently can have an influence on how the claim is received. So I guess what is the best way to explain this? There was this very big settlement in relation to asylum cases. I don't remember the exact year. I think it was in the early 90s. And what they were able to show in this class action lawsuit was that the US was adjudicating cases of asylum seekers from Central America and denying approximately 97% of them. But when they were adjudicating cases of individuals who came from former USSR countries, they were adjudicating those cases at an extremely high rate of success. And so there was this lawsuit called the ABC settlement that demonstrated that there was bias in the way in which those claims were reviewed. And I think that that experience still plays out today, if that makes sense.
So is that something that could be used by somebody in a case to cite that?
So in the actual settlement, what happened is they re-interviewed all of those individuals. So they re-adjudicated all of those particular claims. But there is, so as an example of specifically how that plays out, part of the evidence that is frequently looked at by the judges, by the government, by asylum officers, is something called the Department of State Country Conditions Reports. And those country conditions reports are generated by the Department of State and consular officers. During the prior administration, there were high-level officials within the Department of State who were exposing the fact that they were getting heavy political pressure in terms of how they wrote up the country conditions reports for certain countries based on political relationships. So that's not new. That was reported by, that was always my feeling, but that was also reported. And high-level officials quit and or wrote letters, public letters, talking about the fact that they were receiving pressure about how to, even though the Department of State is supposed to be doing an independent assessment of what conditions are in these various countries, they're the ones that also issue, for example, travel warnings to US citizens, where to travel, what level to place them at. That's part of their duties as well. So, you know, cases are very individualized, but I do think sometimes there are factors like that that have an influence. Any other question. I mean, this doesn't end the questions. You can also ask questions after, but should we try to talk about parolees and what we mean by that? And also, do we need a time check? I think that's Tom telling me we've gone on too long.
Can I suggest something? Those of us who are here brought all these wonderful questions that we're giving you, but the people at home must have other questions. So I propose that we hold back our questions so you can finish the rest of the material, and then after that, allow the people at home to ask a few questions. Does that sound okay to us here? Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so the last specific category that I'm going to talk about, but then I'm happy to talk about other ones if people have questions, is parolees, because I think that term has kind of been thrown around recently in the news with the Ukrainian program and Afghanis who were evacuated, and a little bit in the news in relation to the recent arrivals in Martha's Vineyard. And so the very unfortunate thing is parole is a very big umbrella term that gets utilized for a lot of different categories of individuals. So parole is sort of a general authorization that allows someone to either come to the United States or remain in the United States for what they define as an urgent humanitarian reason or a significant public benefit. There's some information that defines that, but these are like not very well defined terms. And so sometimes they offer a parole program for a specific category of individuals. So an example is there's a specific Ukrainian parolee program. There also was an Afghani parolee program. They didn't create a program for it, but they extended, immigration extended to the families of Uvalde the option to apply for parole. We have applied for parole for family members where someone in their family who may have been in the immigration process, but things were taking a very, very long time, and there was an urgent need for them to come sooner. So an example of this is a client of ours who was petitioning for their son, and their son was in process to come to the United States, but in fact his caretaker had passed away, and so then there was a really urgent need to get him here. He was only 10, there was no one to care for him, so we applied for him to come under parole, and he's here and continuing his process through his mom. So again, parole is very loosely defined, which also has its pros and cons. So the pros are that it can be extended in a lot of circumstances that, again, are either a humanitarian reason or significant public benefit, but also it's not something that, it's very discretionary, which means there's a lot of variability in terms of how very similar applications may be treated, and also there's not your ability to gauge the chances of success unless there is a specific program that was announced with some parameters. It's really hard to say. It also falls into that category when we're looking at our spectrum of a temporary status. It doesn't open up a pathway to sort of a permanent status. For example, with our client that I just spoke of, he was already on a permanent pathway. His mother was already applying for him. So we utilized the parole to bring him here for an emergent humanitarian reason, but he continued in his process. But that parole didn't open up a permanent process for him, as an example. So the government has created some specific programs for some individuals they've identified as a group who have a humanitarian need. Again, like I said, most recently, the Ukrainians and the Afghanis. But parole is not, most of those individuals need to now seek some other type of status in order to continue to be lawfully in the US. So parole is not helpful in the sense of it's not a pathway to permanent status, but it is an option for some individuals. It does help some people come to the US or stay in the US who otherwise would not have been able to, but someone who has parole needs to continue to explore what their long-term immigration options may be. Very helpfully on here, and if they circulate the materials, these links are live on the PDF versions of this. There is a explainer. The last link on the sources is from an organization called Immigration Forum, and it kind of just walks through in more detail humanitarian parole and the typical situations in which it's utilized, and again, more of the pros and cons. And the other additional information of these resources that I have are Migration policy is the refugees and asylees. It talks about the 2021, the statistics, a pretty detailed breakdown of where did our refugees and asylees come from, what are their backgrounds, what are the numbers. It has all of that information. And these other links also kind of relate more generally to explaining the differences between asylees and refugees and explaining who parolees are and the differences between those. A parole status is, like many immigration processes, begins with an application and then some amount of supporting documentation. I don't think any application process on the immigration website explains in full what evidence should be provided. So unfortunately, that means most often people do need to rely on someone who has experience with immigration, hopefully an immigration attorney, to advise them of, okay, beyond this form which is required and must be completed, what other evidence outside of the basic evidence that's discussed needs to be provided. So that's parolees in a nutshell. Are there any questions about that? Okay. Yes?
Is occupation any aspect of somebody pursuing a parole need? Somebody, like say a rocket scientist, or somebody that's got a cure for COVID?
Sure. So the question was, is someone's occupation a factor for parole status? And I would say not generally, because we have employment-based options. So if someone does have the cure for COVID, then I am very confident that someone will assist them with an employment-based visa to bring that knowledge here and then help us develop, a vaccine that covers all future mutations, I guess, would be what that looked like. And I do apologize because Tom did say we were going to not take additional questions. So the last two slides are just kind of like general high level, what are things as a community, how can we be helpful and engage and be supportive of our immigrant neighbors? And so I think some of these are somewhat, hopefully are not new information for the folks in this room and in our internets. So one is to refer people to immigration legal agencies so they can get consultations. I frequently have people reach out to me and ask to get referrals for either our organization or some of the, unfortunately, very few organizations that are on the Cape and islands, and or for private attorneys who we think are reputable. Unfortunately, although this is likely true in every area of law, we do see a lot of people who are not scrupulous attorneys. We also see individuals who are not attorneys at all, but are sort of holding themselves out to be attorneys. Part of this does have to do with the fact that the notary laws in the United States are extremely different than the notary laws in many other countries. And in a lot of other countries, when you are a notary, you may potentially also be a licensed attorney, or in some countries you have to be a licensed attorney to be a notary. So there are individuals within communities who sort of hold themselves out to be as attorneys who are notaries. That is something we see frequently. So it is important for folks to get at least reputable consultation so that they're not misled about what their options are. Or we've even seen some attorneys and non-attorneys file applications that included information that was fraudulent, not known to the client that that was the case. So that's always very concerning. And then this part you're already doing, educating yourselves, understanding immigration. I didn't do a piece on what we call Know Your Rights. I'm happy to do an extremely brief version of that, or if not, there are many other wonderful materials and trainings that I can provide to folks that can be circulated. What we mean by Know Your Rights is everyone in the US has some amount of constitutional protections, and that applies even to our immigrant neighbors and friends as well. And sometimes knowing what their rights are can be very critical to actually protecting their immigration status and protecting them from some of the consequences of interaction with law enforcement or just other things that unfortunately befall folks who are already vulnerable. In addition, trying to know how to sort through the information, of which there is a lot out there about immigration law. This was particularly true in the prior administration. The changes in immigration law were extremely frequent. there was a professor who was actually tracking immigration law and policy, mostly policy, immigration policy and regulatory changes during the Trump administration. And during that period, there were more than 1,000 changes. So it is important to know where to find good information. Fortunately, I have provided some information about some very reputable sources on where to get updates on things. You know, engaging in administrative and legislative advocacy, it can be very hard and sometimes even risky for individuals to kind of engage in legislative or administrative advocacy on their own behalf. Also, some individuals who are not citizens, maybe their voices are not heard as strongly as their citizen neighbors by their elected officials. So I think sort of educating yourself first about, you know, what would be helpful to the immigrant community, but then also using the power of your voices to help our neighbors is a really important and supportive piece that can happen. That can be on a state level, a local level, it can be on a federal level. I think you're breaking the rules, but I think it's allowed. Yes, Ron?
Well, I was partly going to ask Nancy if there have been any texts or emails coming in from the outside that we would want to hear those. But I wanted to ask about the Afghan parolees. I think most of the Afghans who have been admitted to the U.S. are on humanitarian parole. And speaking of advocacy efforts, I think there is an effort to extend that parole status, isn't there?
Yes, I think there's a combination of both a legislative option and an extension of parole for Afghanis. Similar for Ukrainians as well, that there's some legislative options, and the administration did announce a temporary protected status for Ukrainians, so that will capture some folks. Again, that's a temporary status, so it's not a long-term solution, but it at least gives them lawful means to stay here and access to work authorization.
Thank you. And while I'm standing up, I just wanted to say that I'm sure we would like to hear a little bit about your experience at the Joint Base over the last couple of weeks.
Yes, sure. I'll just finish the end of this list, and then that will be the end of our prepared presentation, which are things that you're already doing, which is providing social and community support to recent arrivals, connecting people with other service providers like health, housing, food assistance, language classes, etc., and just being a welcoming and supportive community. I think sometimes when I meet with a new client, I'm reminded again about how difficult it is to navigate the context of a whole new country, especially in a language that you don't communicate in. So as a very small, not harmful example of how this happened, I was meeting with my client. I asked him to send me something. We went over what my address is. We had texted about it. He had all the information. And he kept sending to me and saying, it keeps coming back to my house. I said, that's really weird. Why is it returned? How much postage do you put on? What's going on? He's like, no, I put like extra postage. I'll try it again. He sent it again. It came back to his house again. And so we're having these conversations on the phone. And then finally I saw him in person again, and he showed me the envelope. And he said, yeah, they keep sending it back to me. And I realized that the manner in which he addressed the envelope made it look like he was the recipient of the letter and I was the sender of the letter, because where he came from, they just addressed their envelopes differently than how we address our envelopes. And that very small thing led to it didn't harm his case in any way, but it led to this 2-week delay of him trying to mail me this document repeatedly. And I just think it's a good example of how even the very smallest things are challenging to navigate when you don't have that context of having navigated the systems in the US, or when we talk to our clients and say, great news, in Massachusetts, you might be eligible for healthcare. So you just need to go to your local health center and meet with a Mass Health navigator and sign up for healthcare. And I'm like, these words might not have any meaning in terms of their words. They have a meaning, but they don't contextually mean anything to you for me to say, go talk to a Mass Health navigator. They might be thinking I'm talking about a ship captain, So that's just, I think, in addition to being welcoming, I think being patient and also just understanding that people have dramatically different experiences. And those experiences, I think, really enrich our community and enrich us as a country, but it also means that they might need some additional assistance in learning all of the systems that we navigate, hopefully relatively easily on the day-to-day. The very last sheet, like I said, is just some, these are some major national nonprofits or organizations that I think provide very reliable information and updates about immigration. But that is what I have prepared for today.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. A couple of questions. One person asked, what are the prospects for fixing our immigration system?
I would ask, what are our prospects for fixing our democracy? Yeah, I'm not feeling real hopeful at the moment because, it takes, we have decided as a country that immigration is a very contentious issue, even though we have also decided as a country that we are a nation of immigrants. And how we hold these very and opposite opinions together in our minds, I do not understand. And so I would like to think that we will reach a place where we can commit to real immigration reform. And I think it is important as individuals engaging potentially in political work and advocacy to remind ourselves that we choose our immigration policy. The fact of how it is currently structured was a series of many choices over a long period of time. And so we can unchoose the worst parts of that system. And I think a lot of times people say, well, you can't just start over, you can't, and to which I say, why not? We built the system, we can change the system, but I don't feel super hopeful that it's going to be a short-term challenge for us.
Thank you. Another person asked, why are the children of asylum seekers not allowed to attend public schools? What schools can they attend?
So all children in the United States are entitled to a primary, secondary education. So if folks are not being allowed to enroll in school, so through high school, so if individuals are not being allowed to enroll in school, no matter what their immigration or lack of immigration status is, please let me know, and our education attorneys would be very happy to speak with them. Everyone is entitled, there's a Supreme Court case that established that all children are entitled to at least primary, secondary education in the US. But in terms of beyond that, private institutions are allowed to admit anyone they want. They are also allowed to offer private scholarship to anyone they want. Also, individuals who don't have lawful status, it's not that they're not allowed to attend our state institutions, it's that they're required to enroll as international students and pay out-of-state tuition rates. So it becomes economically not viable for some families for their children to attend institutions of higher education, even though they're eligible to attend.
We'll be referring a family to you.
Great.
Are all the people coming to the southern border of the U.S. Are all the people coming to the southern border of the U.S. asylum seekers?
No, not all of the individuals who are coming to the U.S. are asylum seekers. I guess in one way it would depend on how you define that. I would say that the vast majority of people who are coming to the U.S. southern border are doing so for reasons of safety and security. But whether or not their individual situation would constitute an asylum claim would be a case-by-case analysis. And I also think that our asylum law in the United States is not sufficiently broad and flexible to capture individuals who I think were intended to be captured by the Refugee Convention, in my opinion. But yeah, not every individual, but I do think most people are coming to the US for reasons that relate to safety.
Okay. One person wrote, I am friends with undocumented folks. Would it be good advice to suggest applying for asylum?
I would say it is not good advice to give legal advice as a non-attorney. So I
Okay.
would not recommend that. However, I would recommend that people get legal consultation with reputable immigration providers. And, you know, that is up to that individual and the attorney to make an assessment of what legal options might be available, of which maybe asylum is one, but not necessarily.
Okay, thank you. Does one with TIP status have the automatic right to work, or must such a person apply for that right?
So I think that autocorrect was TPS, I'm going to presume. So when someone applies for temporary protected status, they have the option of also applying for work authorization. It's not required that they apply for work authorization. So it's not, they have the right to apply for it, and they would generally be granted if they're granted temporary protected status. But no, it's not. They're two different applications.
And the last question I have is, what do you think should be done to fix the immigration system?
How much time do we have? No. I don't, you know, my opinion is that we really need to reimagine foundationally what we as a country are trying to achieve with our immigration policy. Are we a country who is welcoming of individuals from other countries? Are we a country who is basing it only on skills or money? Are we a country who believes in family reunification? Are we a country that wants to provide protection to others who are vulnerable? There's not, if there was a magic wand that could be waved, I would be everywhere trying to make that happen. I don't think there is a simple policy fix, but I do think the best way to consider how we fix immigration policy is to have our own reckoning about what are we trying to actually achieve, and why are we trying to gatekeep people from coming to a country that does, I think, have plenty. I don't think it's distributed very well, but in theory is a country that has plenty. And how can we be more equitable about that within our own borders, but also how do we as a country with much to give make ourselves a better country by welcoming people and providing opportunities when those who came to the US in the first place were also provided opportunities. Yeah.
A family that has children born in the US, the children are citizens, is there, if the family itself, when they came, did not register or whatever, they're under the, is there a place for them to go? Or is there a status that they would have because they have children who are American citizens?
So the question was whether a family who has US citizen children would have a pathway to legal status for the parents. And the answer is maybe, sometimes, but not always. Yeah. And also, it's a long wait. So children, in theory, could petition for a parent if they're a US citizen, but they cannot petition for their parent until they're 21 at minimum. And as the same case that we talked about earlier with someone petitioning for a spouse, based on their immigration history, based on a lot of other factors, they also still may not be eligible.
Do they remain US citizens if their family, including them, are deported?
So US citizens cannot be deported from the United States unless their citizenship is revoked.
But their parents, if their parents
So
are
yeah,
deported.
if their parents were to be deported and they were to leave the country, they remain US citizens.
Okay, they do remain
Correct.
citizens.
So that was part of the discussion around, so a US citizen can be outside the country for as much time as they would like to be, and they stay a citizen. So, yeah. Yeah?
I'm so naive. The question about the southern border, clarify that. If a person shows up in Texas, say, and they don't claim, he or she does not claim asylum status, does not seek asylum, are they just automatically deported? As if someone, I mean, if they come to a checkpoint
Yeah?
and say, can I come in?
Yeah.
Are they swam across the river and is apprehended there?
So the question is, on the southern border, if individuals are apprehended and they're not claiming asylum, or they're presenting themselves at a port of entry and also not claiming asylum and just asking to come in, are they deported? And the answer is it depends, but generally yes. So the asylum process is a specific process that we must allow individuals to access. I think that we have been blocking that access in various ways for a long time now, including up till now. But in theory, they should have access to a process. An individual who doesn't claim fear of return to their country can be deported under something called expedited removal, which means they don't have a court process, they're just deported from the country.
So there must be pro-immigration counselors, lots of them, counseling these people at the border to claim immigration, to claim asylum status.
The question was, are there immigration advocates at the border sort of counseling folks on claiming asylum in order to allow them to access legal process? And I would say not particularly, because individuals are entering in sort of all different irregular ways, and there's not an easy way to kind of communicate with that group that if they have any possible claims of fear, that they should be making them. We've also certainly had the experience of individuals who said that they did claim that, and then their paperwork says that they did not, and then they were deported. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Do certain religions have, less of a chance? I mean, I think since 9/11, we all know that unfortunately the Muslim faith really suffered from that. And on half of my side of the family was, they're Lebanese Syrian, they were Christians.
Yeah.
So I think, and this was back in 1912, when it was okay to be a Christian. And good comment. I'm just curious as to whether or not certain faiths, if it's maybe not to your advantage to admit if you have a faith that's not a particularly popular one right now.
The question was whether individuals from certain faiths may have a harder time with their asylum claims based on sort of the generalized perception or favor that individuals from a certain faith may hold in general opinion. And I would say, it's really a case-by-case basis. I think the question of whether or not there is bias in adjudications, of course there's bias. Because we are humans and we are flawed, and we all have some bias, but some of us work a lot harder to mitigate that bias than others. And not all the individuals that choose to go into the federal government and work, I guess, in some instances actually directly against the interests of immigrants necessarily work at all to mitigate bias that they have. So I wouldn't say blanket that, people from a certain faith would not have a successful claim, but I would say that, yes, of course there's bias within the immigration system. And, we have to keep that in mind. We do actually keep that in mind when we are documenting cases. And if we think that someone's particular case, for whatever reason, would be subject to more scrutiny for some reason, we take that into consideration in terms of how we prepare the case. But that's all we can do to mitigate that, unfortunately.
About gangs? Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a quick question about gangs. I know at one point in the last years, maybe 5, it was indicated that if your reason for being here was because of extortion from a gang or something with a gang, that was not a good case to make because it would imply that you had involvement with gangs. And that was, is that a simple thing to speak to, or do you have a thought on that?
So the question is whether that there had been reports that asylum claims that were based on gangs, meaning extortion from gangs or otherwise being pursued by gangs, that those would not be strong claims for asylum, and whether or not that has changed or sort of commentary on that. And what I would say is claims that are related to gangs are still very difficult to win. But part of the strategy that we employ, and I think that others employ, is trying to educate the asylum office and asylum and immigration court judges on the fact that there are some countries in which gangs are operating as de facto government. The government has essentially withdrawn services from whole areas. And so we can't continue to treat this as just criminal activity that's outside the scope of what the government has responsibility for, when the governments in fact are no longer governing in those areas, and or in some cases where the government is directly working in conjunction with gangs. Then our argument is that that is an extension of the government at that point, and so this should fall under the protection. But certainly those claims are complicated, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And this is one example of the reference I made to saying that I think that our asylum laws have not been applied sufficiently flexibly. They haven't been applied with enough flexibility. There we go, I'll just pivot. To capture this type of changing situation, where my understanding from my clients and also from experts that we've worked with is that there are some countries and some regions within countries where there is no government anymore. The gang is the government. And so how can we continue to say that those individuals are really just fleeing general criminal enterprise when there is no one to protect them and no one providing any support for them?
Well, I'm sorry, but we have to bring this program to a close. Emily, thank you so much. You have just given us an incredible amount of information. And you were so generous with your time, and thank you for fielding all of those questions. I know that this has been an incredibly busy time for you because you're involved with the migrants from Venezuela. I have one quick question. What is the better word to use, migrants or immigrants?
In terms of what's the better word, I'm not sure. We have generally used the term immigrants.
Okay.
That's more commonly what we use.
Okay.
But.
Well, again, thank you so very much. And I'd also like to thank Mark, our media person, and Darren, the pastor of this church, and the viewers at home. Thank you for watching today, and those of you who joined us, thank you. Now, there will be a recording available. You all have my email address and my text number, so if you want access to the recording, let me know. And I'm going to plug, obviously you're all interested in the issue of immigration, so I'm going to plug a couple of events. We are going to have an interfaith Thanksgiving service the Sunday before Thanksgiving, and the theme of the service is celebrating the magnificent abundance of peoples and cultures. So this is an opportunity for you to pray with immigrants and to pray for immigrants. It will be at 2 o'clock at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Harwich, and there are flyers on the table. Also, we're going to have a fundraiser called Very Veggie Dinners. There are pamphlets on the table, and I'll be also giving you some information online if you would like it. Basically, what we're asking people to do is to eat one vegetarian meal a week, and the difference between a vegetarian meal and a meat-based meal is about $1 per meal. So if a couple had a vegetarian meal, and I'll supply the recipes, then at the end of the month, we're asking you to donate the difference, which would be about $8, to the NASA Interfaith Association, and we'll use it to help immigrants. So on the pamphlet, or you can email me and I'll send you information, it tells you how to log into NASA Interfaith Association and access the recipes. Once a week, I will put up 2 recipes. One will be an ethnic recipe from a country that refugees come from, and one will be a more traditional recipe for those who like mac and cheese or veggie lasagna, something like that. But we hope that people will be willing to participate. I think it'll be fun to try different recipes from different countries, and it would really help immigrants as well. So again, thank you for attending. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest. And Emily, thank you again. You've been absolutely outstanding. And have a nice evening.